Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the third plenary session of the day 2 of this conference, COVID-19, Changing Culture. This session is on the impact on audiences. The part 2 of that is about looking at virtual experiences. So specifically, we'll be looking at how digital and online experiences have changed relationships in organisations and audiences, whether positively or negatively. So I'm your chair for this session. I'm Oliver Mantell from the Audience Agency, and I am, by way of description, a blonde-haired white male wearing a black t-shirt. Do please introduce yourselves in the chat so that people can know who else is in the room, but also to note that we have Trish, the live transcriber, who's been toiling away the last couple of days. Do please help to make her life easier by not talking over each other. But if you want to use the live transcription, there should be a link in that chat as well. I'm really looking forward to today's session. We've got loads of different viewpoints on this topic, combining looking at some specific organisations and their activities during COVID, but also mixed in with some academic and other research. So we'll be hearing from Graham Main from the Big Burn Supper in Scotland, Ava Nieto-McAvoy from the University of Cardiff, Anne Tregiani from the Audience Agency, one of my colleagues, Harry Weeks from the University of Newcastle, and Jenny Williams from Revolution Arts. So each of the speakers will give a short presentation based on their research. And once they've all done their bits, there'll be then a chance to have a bit of a Q&A. So do please post questions in the Q&A tab that you'll see next to the chat function, and we'll pick questions out from there. Or you can raise your hand at the bottom of the screen, and we can kind of invite you on the virtual stage to say your bit. So those are our speakers. You know the format in terms of adding things to the Q&A. It just remains to be said really that we will be having further conversations after the session in the table discussions, and I'll say a bit more about that once we get to it. But without more preamble, I'm going to pass over to Graham for the first of the sessions to tell us all about Big Burn Supper and its transition online. So please, Graham.
Hello everybody, nice to meet you all. Just to introduce myself, I've got brown hair, I'm a white male with blue eyes, although it looks quite pixelated, and I've got a spaniel in the picture behind me. I'm very pleased to talk about Big Burn Supper. Just to give you a little bit of a lowdown, we're a community co-op set up about 10 years ago, based in South Scotland, and our purpose really is a co-op. We've got about 250 members and 10,000 stakeholders who are part of our membership, and every year we produce community arts events, but mostly we produce a winter Fringe festival which is called Big Burn Supper. And those of you who might make the connection, our primary sort of celebration is around Burns Night itself. Burns Night is I suppose Robert Burns is like Scotland's William Shakespeare, if a little drunker and a little bit rough around the edges perhaps. But Burns Night actually is an ancient tradition that we have in Scotland, especially in the west coast of Scotland, over the last 300 years, where we come together in the middle of winter. And it's a very organic celebration that people do at home, or something that organisations might sort of celebrate, especially cultural organisations. So our organisation is basically based on trying to amplify and make something bigger of that. We've been going for 11 years. I've got a wee video to show you, but just to give you some context about our particular challenges in COVID and as the pandemic sort of started, only 10% of our budget comes from public funding. So I'll say that to begin with. So everything else that we did in this year was driven around what was realistic, basically, and our budget roughly is around 1 million per year. So that meant that I think by the time we got to May or June, we were having very, very serious questions about our existence and how we would be able to survive going forward. And I think that helps you understand what we did as the world went into pandemic. Can we cue video? I'm trying to be quite swift with that there. So it's a short little introduction. I thought if we're talking digital, let's give you a digital sort of story, basically. our digital story, really, Big Burn Supper, every year, our purpose is to get everyone together to sing Auld Lang Syne. And for 3 weeks, we do it every single night. The key themes of our projects is togetherness. We're rural, so isolation is a huge problem. Loneliness and well-being is factored in by that. So we do 3 weeks worth of festivals and events. So this is where we were basically before COVID. March the 23rd, the world goes into lockdown. And by about 5 days later, we had already engineered our community. This is a piece of community theatre. We created it on Zoom. And I should say that actually we've been working with Zoom for 3 years beforehand, and we've been testing digital ideas since our inception. This was the second stage. About 4 weeks later, we created a pan South Scotland kind of community-led. They would just throw us films in, showing us what they were doing, and lots of it looks really rough. And, you know, it's not really about the quality for us. It was really about connecting our community. There's loads of things we did. We then moved on to creating we became a TV station for our local community, a magazine show, if you like, where we could teach you dancing, we could teach you costume making. And what we tried to do was basically, I think everyone did, is take all of our artistic practice and digitalize that. And imagine that we wanted to keep connecting that audience and as participants. So the consumer audience was important to us, but more so actually was our weekly audience. But for us, I think the biggest challenge we faced was, how do we stage this festival and make it look high quality on the 25th of January? So for us, we decided, let's not stage a festival. Let's try and focus onto the very meaning of what our purpose is, and that is to connect the world to Burns Night. So we used all of our failings. I should say that a lot of what we tested didn't work during the year. And because of that, we basically then I think fine-tuned this way of working, this digital kind of production, and it was really successful. We basically went from an audience of 26,000, which is our usual in-person audience, and we achieved an audience of 600,000 on one stream, which for those that are aware, it was a live pause that we did basically because of the limitations that came into Scotland late December and January. And so that's our story really. It's really about how we used the sort of digital testing from our inception, used further testing, I think, to keep connecting with our audience, and lots of playing, and lots of independence in the way that we would play to finally create this marvelous piece of work that made everyone feel brilliant. But, you know, from us looking at an organization that connected 26,000 local people, and suddenly we were getting an online audience in India and Russia, you know, the big question we've got now is, that felt really good to connect with that audience, but actually our purpose is always our rural audience. So big questions we've got now is, how do we do that, and who pays for it, and how will we make it work?
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Talking of immediate responses and, you know, this quick switch online, I know the next speaker, Ava Nieto McAvoy, has done some research on the online reaction to some of those initial and those sort of early weeks and months. So Ava, if you could take it away.
Thank you very much. So by way of presentation, I am a researcher at Cardiff University and at the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Center. I am a Spanish white cis woman in my 40s with dark curly hair, wearing a black cardigan. And I have 2 slides to present to you today. I'm going to be presenting findings from research conducted by Dr. Jenny Kidd, also from Cardiff University, and myself, into social media engagement during the first 6 weeks of lockdown starting in March 2020. So using the hashtags culture in quarantine and museums at home, we explored whether and how cultural organizations and audiences were finding new ways to engage and interact on Twitter. So engagement with tweets is usually measured via numbers of retweets, likes, and comments. And while we use these metrics as our starting point, our aim was to better understand the quality and depth of interactions on Twitter rather than just their reach. So we analyzed sort of the close to 9,000 tweets for these kind of more, using quantitative methods. And some of the high-level findings won't be that surprising. The first one is that most users tweeting with these hashtags are the institutions themselves or cultural workers. Members of the public account for only 7% of our tweets, and even fewer, as far as we could tell, are new audiences. The second finding here is that video content, as we know from social media, was the most popular content. A third finding was that the sample was fairly international, but again, it's mostly representative of the English Twitter sphere. And finally, for those tweets located in the UK, again, another is not really a surprise, but London and Southeast were the most active regions. However, we wanted to analyze some of this data qualitatively. So we took 5% of these tweets and we analyzed them for themes, tone, and values, which can give us a richer picture of some successful elements that spark conversations with and between users. And you can see some of our results on screen. And you see the themes there and some of the values that we coded for. And what I'm going to do now is show you 2 examples of tweets that gain a good response from the public in terms of comments, primarily. And we heard yesterday from Mark Robinson that the so-called pivot to digital practices and institutions has been underscored by a more fundamental pivot to people and purpose. And I think that these examples and the success of these examples in terms of audience response speak to this as well. So yeah, that's the next slide. Thank you very much. So we can see 2 tweets here. The first one is from BBC Arts, which on the 8th of April tweeted a short film featuring, and I quote, a poignant and unique performance of the swan, right? So the tweet reflects the theme of arts as a way of coping, and that was the most popular theme in our sample, which values the arts in relation to well-being and care. So you can see from some of those examples that the quotes in replies of the audiences, prove that there was a connection with these elements, or at least in the medium reaction to some of these elements. Those responding say that the piece is all the more impactful for having been filmed in the performer's home at this time when everybody found themselves at home. So we suggest here that we find a privileging of empathy and intimacy over and above traditional production values. So this is evident elsewhere in our sample as well. So we were talking yesterday about some of the first outputs that were coming out of institutions that were perhaps not that well produced. And again, let's bear in mind, we were talking about the BBC. I'm not saying this wasn't well produced, but, some kind of that more reactive first productions of things that were, quick and dirty, going out there, and people valuing them for that, for the connection that they produced. I'm going to go to the other tweet, which is one of my favorites. It's from a tweet from the 21st of April, so a few weeks later. So the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers Museum tweeted this image from their collection, right? It's a much smaller institution with roughly 5,000 followers on your Twitter account versus around 23,000 of the BBC Arts account. But this tweet still made it into the top 10 tweets with most comments in our sample, in our 9,000 tweet sample, ahead of the BBC Arts tweets as well. So it falls within another major theme that we coded for. We called it education, very broadly defined, which include tweets like this one that nods to lessons to be learned from the past in relation to the circumstances of lockdown, even if lockdown isn't necessarily mentioned. It's a very good example of reusing items from the collections rather than creating new content, done with humor, calling for engagement, and signaling efforts to open up conversations with audiences. So on the back of this national chat about tea, and it's a hashtag National Tea Day, I don't know if you can see that, the theme resonated well with specific community of museum followers that shared a past experience, as you can see from some of the comments. So there are many tweets in our sample which celebrate social values in this way and others, referring to communities, welfare, climate change. Elsewhere in that sample, and this has been spoken about, again, it's been some of the findings from other research, we find a tendency to connect the arts and culture with place in ways that reaffirm the importance of locality and nature, even if digitally mediated. And finally, other successful tweets, and I'm not showing you an example here, but they do celebrate amateur and professional creative practices, including hybrid initiatives that bridge the digital and physical spaces, often in very playful ways. And I think we're going to be talking about this more. So my 5 minutes are almost done. I just wanted to highlight that this production and creation on social media on the part of institutions, and we've heard about this before, has had its challenges as well. And we've conducted other research on this experience of those digital workers, particularly in museums, producing this content. And we find, again, I'm going to highlight 3 things. Inequalities, not just among different institutions and their digital maturity, which is quite important for the success of this so-called pivot to digital, but also what counts as success, between institutions and within institutions, digital inequalities among audiences as well. And we've spoken about that, and I'm going to hear more. Also, two last points. One of it is that it's time to have a conversation about monetizing some of this content. Free was one of the keywords that appeared repeatedly in this sample. And again, it was free for very good reasons, but perhaps, this is the opportunity to move forward. And finally, the big question is, how do we sustain this pivot to digital in terms of resources, skills, technology, audience engagement, business models, but also, just to add to all of the challenges, environmentally. So what steps do we need to take to ensure that this is also a green pivot to digital? So thank you very much. I'm done. And that's it.
Gosh, thank you very much. Lots there. I'm really struck by that question about what counts as success, particularly as it came out of Graham's as well. I think that's maybe a question that's going to circle back around as we keep talking. Now, next up is Anne Treggiani from the Audience Agency, talking about a piece of research that I'm certainly very familiar with from having worked with her on it. So, Anne, do you want to?
Thank you, Ollie. Yes, I shall quickly describe myself. Again, I'm a white woman of a late middle age, I think is the correct way to put it. I've got reddish hair and I'm wearing glasses, and I'm sitting in my living room, and I apologise if I am visited by my cat, who obviously takes a great interest in virtual engagement, so I can't stop him. Right, and he's ginger too. So, but just to pick up what Ollie was saying, is I have to say I think it might be more. I think Ollie is slightly closer to as chair. Nevertheless, I don't think you're necessarily allowed to step out of role, but I think you may know some of this data better than I do in the granular sense. So I am taking a slightly bigger picture look at some of the findings from our cultural participation monitor, where we've looked particularly at people's changing attitudes to what they do in a very broadly leisure and culture space through lockdown before, and what they're saying they're going to do afterwards. So we talked about these things a lot yesterday. I know not everybody was there, but some of you were. So not to go over old ground and to try and move us on, I'm just going to very quickly recap to say, on the one hand, we can see from the Participation Monitor, and indeed from our work with other organisations, and also a piece of research we did into a survey that was embedded in people's digital content, we can see that there is definitely something about the new flowering of digital offer which is to be celebrated. So in one sense, there is no doubt that this plethora of new digital opportunities to engage with arts and culture has really made a huge difference to some people, in particular disabled audiences, and next generation of engaged arts audiences. So the numbers of people engaging skew much more towards younger audiences, and therefore to more ethnically and culturally diverse audiences than we see for live audiences. So really interesting, something very important to be celebrated there and not to be let go of. We've also seen a small increase in the number of people who we might think of as being off-grid, in other words, older engaged audiences, but people who live quite a long way from the cultural infrastructure, if you like. So all hugely important, and things to build on that we shouldn't slide back to, in my view. It is worth saying that we have to qualify this notion of access. I just want to say that again, because we can also see quite clearly from these statistics, which are from a representative population sample, that we have not particularly picked up new audiences. So if people were not already engaged in doing arts and cultural stuff, our cultural offerings so far, at scale at least, in terms of the population, have not reached any further. So we mustn't kid ourselves that we're suddenly breaking down all those much discussed barriers, because actually it's not quite having that effect. Although of course it is breaking down barriers for other people, and we shouldn't forget that. So I would also say, and I think Jenny's probably going to talk about this as well, that there's no doubt that there are lots of small scale experiments where we can see that digital is having a serious democratizing effect. And I think it's important to remember that I'm talking about population sample, where overall our collective activities have not had that effect, but we have seen examples where that's the case. And I want to come back to this idea of experimentation and testing. So moving on then from where we got to yesterday, here's a few facts to pepper our conversations with. So it's worth saying that 46% of that representative sample, so we can infer broadly of the population, said they were interested in online cultural activities in future in general. 38% of people said that they were interested in continuing to experience the things they were interested in, the art forms, the cultural activities they were interested in live and digital in future. So 40% of people broadly saying they want to keep on doing this. A surprising level of loyalty for me. We know that people have been dashing all over the world in their cultural consumption, but I think around 40% of people were saying that they thought they were more like they would want to engage with organisations they visited in person. Really good news. But there's no doubt that findability is a key issue. So less than a third of people thought they knew where to find those cultural opportunities. So, far fewer people knowing where to find it than actually are interested in it. So that is an issue for us. Similar numbers of people were interested in how digital could enhance their experience of the live experience. So we asked lots of quite detailed questions. There's a lot of really interesting granularity in here. But around about a third of people were interested in how digital might enhance their museum visit, or their visit to a gallery, or their engagement with artists, or their personal creative participation, or a visit to a theatre or a performing arts venue. It is worth saying that 20% of regular attenders thought that they might replace some of their live attendance, if not all of their live attendance, by doing things in the digital space. So clearly that's probably skewing towards those older audiences. It is worth saying, as I wind up here, that 30% of people are interested in more interactive digital experiences. Now, this is a really important fact, because when we look at this interesting skew towards younger audiences, we also say that it's the younger audiences who are, in particular, are looking for more interactive, more participatory, and arguably flexible kinds of experiences. Now, we've known this about the preferences of younger audiences in the live space for quite a long time. So those kind of very sitting down art forms, very sort of formal framings, not much opportunity to come go, and not much opportunity to interact. We know there's been a really noticeable drop off. That audience has been aging statistically for quite a long time. So this is very interesting. So digital space helping us to do to address some of those issues. And also interesting, I think Lily Geisendorfer in an earlier session noticed that digital can create a more democratic space, and we also see that slightly less privileged members of the population are also having interest in these interactive benefits of doing digital. So just to finish off then, I think that what this is telling us is that we must not backslide, and we must keep going in the way that I think Graham so beautifully described earlier on. You talked about the fact, Graham, that you were already testing ways of working in the digital space, and I think this is super important. So for me, all these incredible experiments that we've seen, the ones I'm particularly keen on, listening to the Creative People and Places network. I heard an artist who was working with them saying that she said something like, being in people's living rooms but not in their face has somehow given us massive advantages about how we, things that the old mythology that it's a cup of tea and a face-to-face interaction that starts to build bridges. Actually, we've challenged those ideas. We've heard of amazing projects carried out on WhatsApp, which suddenly can be much, much more democratic in the way that they work. We've got things like the Opera North's much quoted From Couch to Chorus, again, starting with people who want to learn how to sing and working out how you do something that had this mass appeal that Opera North would never have guessed about. And there are lots of them. I'm not going to talk any more about them because we're going to hear them. But the important thing for me is that all of these projects started with the user. And they are all around an innovation practice that goes, start with the users, start with a deep and empathetic and kind understanding of what matters to them, co-create or at least co-evolve with them, and test, prototype and test all the time. Now, these are the behaviours that seem to have led to these really successful interactions, rather than the trying to replicate what artists already do, trying to find ways of shoehorning artist practice into a digital space. So people are waving at me in the digital space saying, shut up. So I'm going to end there and hand over to people who I think have actually been doing that or researching more closely. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, and that point about kindness and compassion is an interesting theme that again bubbled up yesterday as well. So we've talked about some different viewpoints. We'll go over to Harry Weeks now from the University of Newcastle, looking at museums and galleries in particular. So Harry, are you?
Yeah, hi, thank you, Oliver. So yes, I'm Harry Weeks. I'm a white male, 30-something. I'm wearing glasses. I have a beard. I'm in my attic. And yeah, as Oliver says, I've been looking as part of the Centre for Cultural Values project. I've been looking at museums and galleries in the northeast and northwest of England, and that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. So Ava mentioned it earlier. Mark Robinson's mentioned yesterday of these two pivots, the pivot to digital on the one hand and the pivot to purpose on the other. In the interviews that we conducted with staff at museums and galleries in the northeast and northwest of England, we witnessed significant discussion of both. The thing that became most apparent to us was just how interconnected these two have been. So interviews with museums and galleries tended to focus less on digital as a means of reaching large audiences and instead on using the digital to connect with those communities on the doorsteps of these institutions. So the hyper-local, as it keeps getting called. But we kept seeing how these two pivots kind of jar with one another. So we're well aware of the inequalities of access of the digital now, and the digital social deficit is easy to see in the sorry, you're on mutes of any Zoom call. So we looked specifically at how museums and galleries have used blending, where physical or in-person activities have been used to rectify some of the shortcomings of the digital. And when you start to focus on this kind of activity, it becomes clear that for so much of the past year, 18 months, organizations have been engaging in this never-ending problem-solving exercise, negotiating the tensions between this pivot to digital on the one hand and the pivot to purpose on the other. So for instance, one gallery which was using WhatsApp to maintain contact with young people taking part in one of its outreach programs realized that actually having phone data was a significant barrier to people's participation. The first solution of an opt-in phone top-up didn't fly, but when this was changed to opt-out, engagement hugely increased. So in many cases, this process of perpetual problem solving has just not been sustainable. The language of many of our interviews shifted from digital's just not the same, but we're trying to make it work in October 2020 to some of our key constituencies simply can't, won't, or don't engage digitally, and we just don't have the resources to keep trying in 2021, October 2021. Those who reached this conclusion, this second conclusion, tended to be operating under greater financial or operational constraints. Smaller organizations who didn't have the means to problem solve the digital for 18 months plus. So the digital divide impacts organizations too. Whether digital really has worked, though, has been in things that we should have been doing this way in the first place. So this is probably most clearly seen in relation to working practices. Face-to-face meetings involving lengthy travel finally being seen as superfluous and, of course, ecologically unsound. Exhibition design is being done remotely more and more, particularly using 3D modeling tools. One example we encountered involved a US artist no longer flying back and forth from the States for short flying visits, and instead being involved in a far more intense and detailed curatorial process mediated through the digital. Relatedly, museums and galleries are pretty unanimous in the terminal diagnosis for the major international touring exhibition. Again, the ecological impact of such shows is discussed alongside shipping and insurance costs in the face of widespread budget cuts. Here, the digitization of collections and the establishment of online alternatives to touring shows, whatever they might be, is an ongoing endeavor. This, I think, has really significant ramifications for what audiences expect from culture and from their local cultural institutions. So your local art gallery is not now somewhere that acts as your gateway to international blockbuster culture. It just simply can't be in the same way that it once might have been, even if you had a larger art gallery on your doorstep. And here, I think, is somewhere that the digital is going to have a much longer-term role to play. So the pivot to purpose, the pivot towards local culture, local audiences, local communities, is not simply the result of a change of heart on the part of cultural organizations, not to mention a function of changes in funding models and criteria. It must also be seen as a really pragmatic response to the limitations on what cultural organizations can offer at the moment and what audiences expect of them. And this in turn, I think, is going to have a really significant impact on what role audiences see the digital as playing in their cultural consumption going forward. Thanks. Hopefully that was within time.
It was. Thank you very much. And so many fascinating big questions opened there. But anyway, I shan't, at this stage jump in. We've already heard, both actually in this session, but also earlier today, about the incredible value that Creative People and Places projects have delivered through the pandemic and indeed before. And we're very lucky to be hearing from one of them. And so Jenny Williams from Revolution Arts. So please.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here. By way of introduction, I'm Jenny Williams. I'm mixed race. I have brown hair. I'm middle-aged, and I'm wearing a rather lovely blue jumper. So Revolution Arts is a Creative People and Places project. We're funded through Arts Council England, and we're based in Luton in the east of England. And our core purpose is all about engagement. We're interested in communities taking the lead, and we're interested in being reflected of the super diversity of the town that we are in. So our work is about residencies in the community centre or the cafe or in the high street, or it might be the large-scale town centre events. And we're driven by our work with our partners, arts, creative, non-arts partners, voluntary groups, shopkeepers, young people. And what we discovered is through the pandemic, these partners, about 80% of our partners, moved really quickly to mutual aid, and they became the folks that were delivering the crisis emergency foods, the crisis emergency medicines. And it immediately made us think, hang on a minute, well, what's our role? Lots of people have talked about it today. What's our purpose in this town right now? And actually what we wanted to do more than anything was just be present. We couldn't be present in the way of delivering food or emergency medicine, but we could show up. So that gave us the urgency to pivot. I love this word. And that's what we did. We did it without the skills, without the existing knowledge within our organisation, but we did do it with a sense of urgency and what people are saying with a sense of purpose. And so within a month, from Thursday the 17th of April through to Friday the 3rd of July, which was just the day before Freedom Day, so a 12-week programme, we run digital work that took place every Thursday and every Friday. The programme remained the same each week, so we were absolutely able to track what our audiences were doing in terms of how our figures were going, in terms of pandemic numbers, in terms of how the weather was going, because we had a beautiful hot summer, and in terms of what was going on generally, the peak of the lockdown and so on. The programme was for children aged from 5 all the way up to Friday night late lounges, so it's a really interesting audience data that we were able to collect. Not everything worked, and I think that that's part of the thing about reacting very quickly, is that we got loads wrong, and actually it didn't matter. It didn't matter that we were learning whilst doing, and I think that's the phrase we coined. We discovered that audiences didn't like everything we presented. Not all the work was conducive to work online. The children's work didn't work, even though what we presented was great, but the primary school age group was generally very well catered for and had really high profile figures that we couldn't compete with. And we discovered pretty quick that we needed to actually really invest in what quality looked like online, which was investing in rehearsals with our artists, investing in lighting, because sometimes you couldn't see what was on the screen. We had to invest in mics. We had to test different instruments and how they sounded online, and so on and so on and so forth. What really surprised us was the young audience engagement worked really well, and the kind of intimate engagement opportunities for them was really important. What surprised me was how scared I was, because I've never said I don't know the answer to that question. So in terms of my own leadership, it was really challenging. And where do we build from? And what worked for us? What did we take away from this 12-week adventure? Well, what we found out was that hyperlocal really works. I had expected us to reach a global audience, but actually what was really successful for us was our hyperlocal work delivered through our partners that reached local folks in huge numbers that we could never possibly imagine. It really worked when we were specific to audience. We are in a super diverse town, so it enabled us to think about intersectionality of audiences across all sorts of different super diverse groups. And we were able to create intimate spaces, and that particularly worked for specific diverse communities. And that's something we really want to continue. We were really aware that we were operating in people's kitchens, living rooms, dining rooms, and that came with an extra sense of responsibility about how we conducted ourselves as Revolution in people's homes. And one of the things that we question often is that because the climate of when we delivered it is that everybody was indoors and wanting spaces to connect. So whether we ran that program again, would we have the same outcomes and outputs? We're not sure. Looking forward, the kinds of questions we're asking as an organisation, and we don't have the answers at all, is that the hybrid model is really expensive. If we want to do it well, it costs. And so do we charge online? But will our audience come to that? Because actually, it felt like a bit of a public service through the pandemic. We kind of also felt that this hybrid could easily become a monster within our organisation. So we're calling it play. I don't like the word hybrid. It's kind of like we need to rethink and play, and how can we use this as something to enhance our artistic offer. We are really committed to performing live, online, and live offline, and that is part of our engagement strategy. We need new skills. We need skills that cross digital and tech, and makers that are really interested in that intersectionality. We need interactive experiences. One of the projects we did was we distributed 100 ukuleles to people's doorsteps and had a ukulele orchestra masterclass every week, and that worked beautifully. So how can we replicate that? We have an opportunity to engage with intersectional, diverse audiences in a way we've never done before. So we need to go deep, we need to go niche, and we need to test new models with different audiences, and we probably need to do that with audiences rather than to audiences. And I think one of the main things I've learned, it's not about striving for perfection. It's not about us having everything beautiful online. We just need to strive for better engagement opportunities. And lastly, just to pick up that, I don't know if we reached new audiences either. At the time of the pandemic, we needed to maintain audiences. We needed to maintain our connections. Our partners might have reached new audiences, but did we? And I'm not sure what reaching new audiences and what engaging with new audiences looks like. And I think that's our next question.
Gosh, thank you. That's incredibly rich. And that, yes, I look forward to hearing more in the Q&A. Thank you. Speaking of the Q&A, do please keep posting questions in that Q&A section. But in the meantime, I will start pulling out a few plums out of the pie, so to speak. So I've got a question here that lots of people seem to be intrigued by, understandably, which is, what's the panel's view on the ongoing feasibility of digital events now that audiences, or at least many of them, seem to want to rush back to real life events despite the ongoing pandemic? And yeah, and so a note there from Maria's experience, there was a big drop in audience and donations between last winter and this summer. So what do people think about the ongoing feasibility? And if anyone urgently wants to jump in on that question, then obviously you're very welcome to. Otherwise, I shall possibly go to Graham.
Yeah, good. We've been thinking about this as well, actually. In our own context, we had a desire to sort of test Facebook Live ahead of curve, just because we read about it and thought we could, and that definitely paid off for us, because we did a live pause, which was pushed out as a Facebook Live event. So I guess producers are looking to continue to test. There are some new products coming out. Going back to what Jenny was saying there are some really agile technology that's coming out, particularly around GoPro cameras and the ability to patch them through live feed as a splitter, as a sort of editing board. These sort of things are quite interesting, because they would remove the clutter from organizations to be able to, at low cost, be able to deliver some quite cool events. I guess the other question is, if it's free, are they still interested? And do we continue to do that, because it's a good brand exercise? It's good to get our brand out there. But I know from colleagues at fringe festivals, have said that they saw a significant drop-off in expectations from the digital work when that was placed against in-person models. But is that compelled by the fact that we were so desperate to get back out there to sort of just sit and smell theatre again? And could that, you know, I think going back to another point that was made, I think Annie mentioned it in terms of, you know, the disabled audience, but also for us, we're very interested in the rural audience in the middle of winter. It's a complete barrier still. All it takes for us is a bit of snow and all of our events become inaccessible. So can we use that as a positive? Is that an opportunity for us to say, we know that could happen, therefore this event will switch and become hybrid?
Great, thank you. And part of Maria's question was about the kind of whether people will pay now. I mean, Anne, you mentioned something in the chat which you want to expand on.
I did. I was just going to segue from Graham's point about snow creates, you know, throwing up a whole new load of barriers. But actually, don't forget that 40-minute drive time. Most people will not. You know, you've got to be a big fan to do anything that takes you longer than 40 minutes to get there. So we have to remember an awful lot of people live a long way, much further than 40 minutes away from things in general. And actually, that is one of the big changes it's made. So I hear where this plea is coming from. And of course, if you're in the middle of a big city, you've seen a cork out the bottle effect, people dashing, you know, some people, incidentally, people with children is a big factor, dashing out to want to go and do more things. If you do anything at all, program for families right now. But, you know, we've seen people dashing to do those things. But actually, don't forget that for lots and lots of our audiences, particularly those who are a bit more anxious, this is not the case. So I think, you know, we've got a situation where, you know, we do want to service our live offers, and we do, but there's differentiation. Different people need different things from us, and I suppose we also don't all have to provide all the same things to the same people either. So I think this another theme that has popped up a lot around collaboration. How do we create a great ecosystem that everybody can tap into between us? Might also be another way of thinking about how we do that. But yes, on the money front, I forgot to mention, because I just added it in as a last minute thinking, oh yeah, we've got to talk about money as well. But you know, it is noticeable just how many people say that they, you know, the big majority, I mean, 70% of people are saying they think they would be happy to pay. Younger audiences favour the more, as you'd expect, flexible, pay as you go, pay what you can methods. Older audiences, you know, kind of are all right with this membership subscription type model. So lots of variation that we need to play with there. But as Ollie, I think you've pointed out lots of times that we need to get away from the old way you think about, you might price for a ticketed venue, for example, and start thinking about, you know, small amounts of money from large numbers of people, and perhaps not for all of your events. You know, maybe it's for some things and not for others, so that you know, it's a very, very different psychology of pricing that we need to test.
Fab. Thank you. And Jenny, did you have anything you wanted to add? Because I know you touched on the question about paying, but also you'd spoken about the importance of regularity. I thought that might be quite interesting.
Yeah, I think so. And one of the things that we're really interested in is maybe at points that Revolutum provides the infrastructure for other folks to present work. And I really pick up that point about collaboration, Anne, because it is pricey for us, but we do have the actual infrastructure to enable work to happen. So that's the kinds of things that we're thinking of. Who are our partners that we can make this happen with, rather than do we always have to be the folks doing it?
Yeah. There's a, in some ways, related question from Valerie at Tamasha, talking about whether doing both is becoming an expectation. Is that kind of is a norm? I know Anne was saying that we may need to sort of focus on what we do. Is that doing both, do we think, something that's realistic? I mean, Harry, is that something that you've seen?
Yeah, I can definitely see it as an expectation. I'm definitely kind of witnessing it as an expectation. My big worry here is that this plays into the kind of digital divide of organizations, because, you know, as is kind of suggested there's such an enormous amount of resources, not just in terms of kit, which is one thing that loads of us spoke to about. Literally just having the kit produces such a kind of clear division between, you know, usually organizations of a certain size versus smaller organizations, but also in terms of actually having the staff to be able to kind of operate this. So my worry with this, I think there is an expectation emerging, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. But my worry is that if that expectation really kind of, settles in, that the divide of who can live up to that expectation and who cannot is going to become really pronounced and potentially dangerous for smaller organizations.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a real challenge. Does anyone else have anything they want to come in on that?
Can I add just that? I mean, it's building on what Harry just said. Our interviews with digital workers within, so we conducted a series of interviews with people working on the sharp end of the digital work in different galleries and museums and other institutions. And one of the things that they were saying, and there's a question, so I'm answering a little bit this question and another question that I saw in the Q&A asking about whether the institution's readability, or whether the maturity of the institution was significant in this pivot, or whatever we want to call it. And yes, it was definitely, from what people were saying. I mean, this but it's not just the technology. Is what was the attitude of the institution prior to lockdown towards digital? Is it something that's embedded in their strategy in different ways? And again, there are many pivots to digital. And Jenny, at the end of her presentation, made a kind of a summary of the different ways that we can understand the digital. Is it practices of how we collaborate and work within the institution, with other institutions, with partners? Is it about digital products? Are we creating artwork for digital, which is very different from marketing on social media? So, and whether that's embedded in the institutional's strategies and speaking to their missions, then made a difference apart from the kit and technology and the know-how. To the readiness of the institution to react to this. And I guess the pandemic has just highlighted this, and it's something that I guess institutions and have to think within the limitations of time, resources, skills, budgets, money.
Yes.
So not a solution, just like.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Talking of things which are potential challenges, I think there's a really intriguing question here, which maybe those who've been doing the kind of online events themselves might have some interesting experience of. Abby from the University of Manchester has raised the fearful prospect of the bottom half of the internet, saying, given the contemporary horrors of online trolling and culture war battles below the line, how have digital initiatives be able to convey and produce trust? I think it's a really intriguing question. I don't know whether either Jenny or Graham might have a experience of this, or sort of way of dealing with it, or whether anything from the other panelists. Graham, is that you're on mute? Yep.
Yeah. That's a great question. Actually, we experienced this quite negatively because I should have said that I think one of the reasons our audience was so vast was we used Janie Godley. For those that don't know, outside Scotland, she'd been sort of an internet star, but she also came with a deep political kind of point of view. That meant that during the live session, we had to have extra staff patrolling those trolls, really. And I don't know the answer to that, Abby, other than that, I was extremely surprised. We were quite caught unaware. The minute that you have a vast audience online, you become very, very, very targeted. So they were ghosting and replicating our accounts. The only sort of lesson that we came out of that was we're doing an awful lot more in terms of our digital knowledge, safeguarding us in terms of policy, but also thinking about sort of cybersecurity more generally, really, so that they understand that the content that's coming from us is actually us. That's authentic.
Oh, that's an interesting challenge. And Jenny, did you have any?
Yeah, I mean, we actually had to put in place some measures because of the some of the trolls that we experienced, around the Black Lives Matters movements, and it spiked, which was really, really challenging. So we did have to put into place lots of things, which is why it became expensive. We needed to have our safeguarding policies in place. We needed to have 2 hosts, one that can look at the chat and one that could switch down if we had a Zoom, whatever they called it. We had to make sure that we had an announcement before and said we had a policy statement about what we'd done to safeguard the event and what would happen in the event of us having to close down, and so on and so forth. And actually, I think because we did pay such a huge amount of attention to it, made it known, to our audiences both before the event start, at the point of booking and before the event start. But we tried to encourage trust where we could, and it also it changed the nature of some of our programs of work where we said, actually, this is going to be closed and nobody's going to be allowed to come. We're going to ask people to switch on their cameras just for the start, and then they can close the cameras down for the rest of the session, and so on and so forth. So it did actually impact the way that we delivered events.
Oh, that's really interesting experience. So there's an intriguing question from Nina from the Paul Hamlin Foundation about what we can learn from other entirely digital cultural communities, for example, gaming, and whether there's anything that's transferable across from there. Ava, I saw you nodding. Are you just that yes, that's an intriguing subject, or does anyone want to seize hold of that question in terms of?
I don't have an answer, but I agree it's a very good question.
Does anyone else have any reflections on what we could be looking at?
I mean, yeah, I don't know enough about. I think I agree. I think gaming is a really interesting comparison. I don't know enough to be able to say anything with much authority, but I think one thing that gaming as a kind of online culture does quite well is kind of prioritizing the social dimension of gaming. So gaming, now not just being you sitting in front of a screen on your own, but also, having like a chat app open and talking to someone in your headphones while everything's going on. I sound like I'm talking rubbish because I have no real idea what I'm talking about. But the fact that part of the big takeoff of gaming online has been because it is a form of social activity, and I think maybe that we talked about how the pivot to digital and the pivot towards people or purpose interrelates. I think maybe gaming is a kind of interesting example of that. I don't know. Yeah, not much of an example.
Anne, you had
I think Graham and Eva at the same time did that. But so to just say very, very briefly, but I think that's exactly right, Harry. I think when young people are talking about, it's just that's just how you do culture. You just do it talking to other people. You don't sit there in silence, not rustling a crisp packet. You talk to people, and it's a really social experience. So I think that's exactly the point, and it's really hard to survey in a quantitative way for that. But I think that's exactly it. Sorry, Graham, you've done it.
Like everyone else, nothing really to add other than just a realization, I think, from some research our partners did from a rural perspective, and that I think there's quite a lot to learn, given that the LGBTQ audience and participation rurally finds the gaming community and environment very safe. And in fact, during lockdown, the research that we found is that they were increasingly in multi-player settings with people and found it a really kind of holistic, safe space to be. So it's a very good question.
Certainly, one other thing that we saw in our research was just how incredibly widespread gaming is. That's maybe worth noting. That it's very, very mainstream.
I was just going to add to that it's not about gaming particularly, but it's about communities that use other ways of communication that are becoming really prevalent among certain age groups, like the use of certain social media platforms, like, for instance, TikTok. So we did get from some of the interviews, comments of the workers saying that their job within the institution wasn't necessarily very well viewed or respected, particularly prior to the pandemic. Is like, oh, these people in social media who just tweet things or do silly things on. I'm not saying it's all institutions, but some of the bigger museums, and that the pandemic kind of focused everything on them because suddenly they became the museum. Partly digital. Social media is not digital; it's just a tiny bit of digital, right? But who's in charge of these roles and what knowledge can they bring to the role? So it's also taking that seriously as well, asking the conversation. And someone was saying earlier on, they're young people with a lot of knowledge in different areas. If we want to connect with them, we can ask them and hire them to take on these roles as well.
Yeah. And we're very nearly out of time, but there's a question from Lizzie from the University of Leeds that I can't not ask because it's so intriguing, which is, could the panel each describe one thing that really didn't work? And obviously that may be easier for some who were doing the work hands-on themselves, but things that maybe you've heard about that didn't work if you're one of the researchers. Can we maybe go through in the order that you spoke initially, which would put Graham in the spotlight first, if that's okay?
I think I hear this one constantly, but singing, it doesn't really work online in terms of choirs.
Okay, interesting. And I'm trying to remember the order. Was it Ava next?
Yeah, I was next. I'm going to speak to something that Jenny said that resonated with our research as well. Children, it was quite prevalent, the amount of tweets in our sample addressed to children, which is parents, I guess, but not all of them necessarily successful. And from our research, talking to the digital workers, that was something that did not work too well for them across the board. I mean, some institutions did, but generally speaking, and again, might be many reasons for that, but that was something that, yeah.
So the comms targeting that audience.
And activities for children did not always work particularly well. For maybe, as Jenny was saying, because they were quite well covered from schools, etc. And perhaps there's a lot of things going on in that space. Yeah.
Got you. Lovely. Thank you. Anne, the examples you come across?
I don't really want to. I can think of a few things, but I don't really want to diss other people's work and let them do that themselves. But I was going to say that I've seen quite a few quite a few of the pricing things that people tried not working. So I think it's a quite well-known fact that some of the pay what you can type things, vast numbers of people engaged, but tiny numbers of. So it does, you know, that's why I say it's really difficult thing to survey people about, because they tend to be more generous in a survey than they are in the real space.
Yeah, that sounds true. Harry?
Yeah, I mean, the examples that we heard in our research are quite similar to what Ava's talking about. School stuff in particular, there was a sense that everyone, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, was initially kind of producing the same content, not the same content, but kind of similarly directed content as each other. And so certain audiences were really overwhelmed by, you know, come to this, take part in that. And so a lot of that kind of fell by the wayside. That was a big one that we heard a lot about.
Fantastic.
And Jenny?
Yes, the children's work, as I've already said, and we had a harpsichordist that it didn't work. So there's your top tip that I can finish on. Harpsichordists don't work. Sound quality doesn't come through. There we go.
So the lesson there is go and listen to your harpsichord music live. That's good advice for us all. So I won't apologise for ending on a negative, challenging question, because I think one of the things that we've said in this session is that experimenting things and trying things is absolutely fine. So we should be comfortable with that. Thank you for all of our speakers. Graham and Ava and Harry and Anne and Jenny. I think I'm sure I'm not the only one that found so much in that session of enormous interest. We do have an opportunity to discuss more with these speakers and indeed with ourselves and each other in breakout rooms. I say breakout rooms, sort of discussion lounges in a second. What we're going to do is Graham, Ava and Anne are going to be on table 1 in the breakout area, and Harry and Jenny will be on table 2 if you want to carry on the conversations in 5 minutes time. There's also going to be a branch out session looking at how policy works and speaking to researchers about policy, because of course a big strand of the CCV's work and indeed the research has been about how this work directly impacts on policy. So there's conversation there as well if you want non-digital conversations. So do please enjoy the rest of the conference as much as I'm sure you've enjoyed this session. There are more panels, more talks, more networking opportunities. There will be a feedback survey. As a researcher, I feel contractually obliged to say that that's a wonderful opportunity to take. Please do fill it out. And I want to say thank you to our captioner, Trish. I know there's been a lot of words said in this session, so thank you for trying to keep up with those. And again, just a thank you to our speakers and to you, and hopefully see you in one of the lounges in the next few minutes. So yes, thank you all very much.